Hello, everyone, and welcome to the worship and Bible study time of First Baptist Church of Baldwin Park, California. We're so glad that you are joining with us by way of this video. This week and next, we are going to spend time together looking at Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is probably the best known and best loved of all the Psalms. It may even be the most beloved chapter in all the Bible. There's something about this 3,000-year-old psalm that still speaks to our hearts. It speaks to our souls. It's authentic. And I guess the reason for that is David, this is a psalm of David, he was writing about two things that he really knew about. Anybody who tries to write something, the advice they always give to new writers is write about what you know. Well, David knew sheep. He had been a shepherd at one time, and he knew the Lord. In the book of 1 Samuel, David is referred to as a man after God's own heart. Some commentators say that the setting for this psalm is that David wrote this while he was on the run, or after being on the run from King Saul, who was determined to kill David. And hiding out in the Judean wilderness, perhaps without food and water for a while, David was sustained by the Lord. And so this psalm is the result of that experience. So we're just going to go through this psalm phrase by phrase. We're going to do about half of it today and then the remaining half next week. So take out your Bible and let's get started. David begins by saying, "The Lord is my shepherd." That expression is so familiar to us, that statement so familiar that we might miss its impact. But the psalm begins with the declaration that eternal, almighty God is my shepherd. Now that's a bold statement, isn't it? And it's a personal statement. And this personal aspect of the psalm is even more apparent in Hebrew, because in the original Hebrew, what David says is Jehovah is my shepherd. In other words, he uses the Lord's name. So why do all of the English translations say the Lord? Lord is a title, God is a title, but Jehovah, or Yahweh in Hebrew, Jehovah would be sort of the English version of Yahweh. Why do all of the English translations say the Lord when the original Hebrew says Jehovah? And the reason is that the Hebrews they treated God's name with such reverence that when they came to this, or any place where God's actual name was given, they wouldn't read it out loud. In their minds they could read it and say it, but they wouldn't read it out loud. It was considered irreverent to do that. And so a Hebrew who was reading this psalm out loud, when he came to that phrase, Jehovah or Yahweh is my shepherd, in his mind he might read that, but out loud he would say, Adonai is my shepherd. Adonai is the Hebrew word for Lord. And so English translations, and this goes back to the Coverdale Bible, English translation of 1535. That's 76 years before the King James translation. The Coverdale translation began that practice of using God's title, the Lord, rather than his actual name, just, I guess, out of respect for the Hebrew readers. But it's very personal in the original Hebrew. And David is making a point with this by using God's name rather than his title. Just as the relationship between a shepherd and his sheep is personal, David is saying my relationship with God is personal. He could have said the Lord is a shepherd, or the Lord is Israel's shepherd, but instead he says the Lord is my shepherd. And that's a powerful statement. Back in 1975, the Southern Baptist Convention was in the midst of producing a new hymnal for use in worship services in Southern Baptist churches all across the country. And so they appointed a committee of people who would choose which hymns to include in the new hymnal. There were theologians on the committee, there were pastors, there were musicians, and their task was to begin, first of all, with the old hymnal and go hymn by hymn, sitting around that big conference table, song by song, and decide if this hymn would make it into the new hymnal. And when they came to the hymn "In the Garden," one of the theologians on the committee voted against it. He said, "I don't think this hymn should be in the new hymnal." He said, "It's too egocentric. It's too self-centered." And he read some of the lines from the hymn to the other people sitting around the conference table. And if you know that song, that hymn, "In the Garden," you remember how it goes. He walks with me, he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And he said to them, that's too egocentric. It's too self-centered. Well, Russell Dilday, who I think was a pastor at the time, but later became the president of Southwestern Baptist Seminary, he opened up his Bible to Psalm 23, and he began to read, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." His point was made, and "In the Garden" made it into the new hymnal. So David begins with that powerful declaration, "The Lord, Jehovah, is my shepherd." And then he says, "I shall not want." When I was a kid and I would hear that sentence, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," I had no idea what that meant. Because the way we use the word want, it means to desire something, right? It sounds like it's saying, because God is my shepherd, I'm never going to desire anything. But of course, that's not the intent here. It's not the meaning. He's using the word want in a more archaic, old-fashioned use of the word in English. And in this case, it means to lack. So when he's saying, "The Lord is my shepherd, I will not want," he's saying, I will not lack anything that I need. David is expressing confidence that because Jehovah is his shepherd, he will never lack anything that he needs to survive. And again, if the setting of this psalm was David escaping from King Saul, hot on his trail, out in the Judean wilderness with little to eat or drink, but God sustained him, this would have been underscored for David, the truth of this, that because Jehovah is my shepherd, I will never lack anything that I need. Now look, this is a profound statement because it implies not only that God will provide everything we need to survive, but that we will be content with what God provides. The richest man in the world can be miserable, even though he has everything. If you know the story of John Paul Getty, for example, you know that's true. John Paul Getty, at one time, I guess this was back in the 60s and 70s, he was the richest person in the world. He had a fortune that was in the multi-billions of dollars. And this was at a time when very few people ever accumulated even $1 million in a lifetime. And of course, a billion is 1,000 million. And Getty's fortune was in the multiple of billions of dollars. And people who knew him, and if you've ever read about him, say he was the most miserable man on earth. By the same token, a person who knows the Good Shepherd, a person who follows the Good Shepherd and who trusts the Good Shepherd can have very little of this world's goods and be completely at peace, completely content with what he has. And so when David says, "I shall not lack anything," that's an expression of confidence that the Lord will provide, and it is an expression of confidence that we will be content with what the Lord provides. The poorest man on earth can be content with what he has when he knows the Good Shepherd. Now in verse 2, David says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. I did some reading about sheep in preparation for these messages, and one of the things I found out is that sheep are fearful animals. One story I read, one shepherd said that his flock of 300 sheep stampeded when his neighbor's little Pekingese dog got loose. 300 sheep stampeded because of a little Pekingese dog. Philip Keller, who is a Christian and was a shepherd at one time, wrote a book called A Shepherd Looks at the 23rd Psalm. And he said this is what he wrote in that book. Because of their timidity, sheep refuse to lie down until they are free from four things: free from fear, free from tension with other sheep, free from parasites, and free from hunger. Because sheep are fearful, they will not lie down until they feel secure. And helping the sheep to feel secure is the shepherd's job. You know, in every animal society, there is an established order. It seems strange to us humans, but it's a fact. In birds, it's called the pecking order. And we see that in our backyard almost every day. You know, we've been putting bird seed out for the dogs, for the birds rather. And it's funny to watch. It's kind of disheartening, actually, to watch the birds fight over the seed. And the bigger birds will drive away the smaller birds. You know, they become very protective and greedy about the food that's out there. But really what they're doing is there's a pecking order. And the birds who are lower down on the pecking order don't get to eat until the bigger birds have eaten. We had one dove out there who, I guess he was at the very top of the pecking order. He ate so much bird seed over a span of about 6 weeks, he got to be about as big as a chicken. He's at the top of the pecking order, and all the little birds are down at the bottom of it. And sheep have an order like that. It's not called a pecking order, it's called a budding order, believe it or not. In every flock, there is a dominant ewe who will butt. She gets her way by butting all the other sheep away from the best grasp. And because of this behavior, there's always going to be tension in the flock. But when the shepherd approaches, that behavior stops. And the shepherd brings peace and calm into the situation. Now translate this into a human context. What is David saying? David is expressing confidence that the Good Shepherd will remove from our lives all of the obstacles that keep our souls from getting the rest that they need. We live in a world that is filled with people who are striving to be the top sheep. You probably work with people like that. You may live around them. You may have them in your neighborhood or just, wherever you are. And they'll butt you out of the way to get what they want. But rest easy, because this psalm reminds us that the Good Shepherd is close by, and ultimately he is the one who determines our status and our worth. One of the authentic characteristics of those who trust in the Good Shepherd is a serene sense of contentment. In the midst of the world's chaos, the Good Shepherd brings peace. Now, continuing on in verse 2, David writes, "He leads me beside the still waters." Most animals will drink from moving water, like a stream, for example. Horses will, goats will, oxen will, cows will. But a sheep will only drink from still water. So the shepherd not only has to find water for his flock, he has to find still water for his flock. And the sheep feel safe and secure because the shepherd leads them to the still waters. One of the great hymns in our hymnal was written by a Baptist preacher named Joseph Gilmore. And he wrote the hymn after meditating on this phrase, "He leads me beside the still waters." And the hymn he wrote, it's one of my personal favorites, is He Leadeth Me. Do you remember how it goes? He leadeth me, O blessed thought, O words with heavenly comfort fraught. Whate'er I do, where'er I go, where'er I be, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. And that's the assurance that David expresses here. And now moving on to verse 3, look at what he says. He restores my soul. Now, verse 3 is connected to verse 2. Only God can restore a soul, and he can do it in a variety of ways. Sometimes, in order for God to restore our souls, he has to make us lie down and rest. That's the connection between verse 3 and verse 2. How many testimonies have you heard from people who said something along the lines of, I had to end up in a hospital bed in order for God to get my attention and make me slow down? Now, that's the assurance that David is expressing here, that God will ultimately restore our souls as we need it. And then moving on in verse 3, he says, He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. You know, it's interesting that the Bible uses a sheep to represent us. I can tell you, I have never in my life identified with sheep. You know, I've never thought of myself in that context. Songwriters write songs about, soaring on the wings of eagles, not about grazing with the sheep. But sheep do have one particularly admirable quality, and it is that they'll follow their shepherd wherever the shepherd is leading them. The sheep have learned to trust the shepherd, and wherever the shepherd leads, they will go. I don't know why, but as I was preparing this message, hymns kept coming into my mind. I've already mentioned a couple of them to you, and here's another one I thought of as I read this verse and meditated upon it, about the sheep following the shepherd wherever he goes. Remember that great hymn from the hymnal, Wherever he leads, I'll go? Made me think of that. There's a lot of great truth, a lot of great theology in our hymnals. And the sheep know the truth of that hymn, and they know the truth of this verse, that the shepherd will lead them where they are supposed to go. And I want you to notice, look a little closer at this verse. The sheep don't find the path, the shepherd does. The sheep don't walk on the path alone, the shepherd leads them. You know, cattle can be driven, but sheep can't be driven. Sheep have to be led. And I guess in that sense, we humans are a lot like sheep. You can't drive people, not for very long anyway. People have to be led. And as long as the sheep follow the shepherd, they are on the right path. Now, did you hear that? Let me say it again. As long as you follow the Good Shepherd, you are on the right path. Reminds me of that great verse from Proverbs chapter 3, verse 6. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. As long as you are following the Good Shepherd, you are on the right path. And then our last phrase that we're going to look at today, in verse 4, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. And we're going to look at for you are with me next week. Now, this is about protection, this verse. I will, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, we read earlier about, green pastures and still waters, and those are beautiful images, beautiful promises. But they're not the only blessings of the Good Shepherd, and perhaps not even the primary blessings of the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd protects his sheep. I read that there is an actual valley in Palestine called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. This isn't just imagery, metaphor here. There is an actual physical valley in Palestine right outside of Jerusalem called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. It leads from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea, and it's high up in the mountains. It's a narrow, treacherous path fraught with danger. And the sheep that travel on this path are in constant danger of falling. But the sheep are not afraid. Why? Because the Good Shepherd is with them. Wherever the sheep are, the shepherd is. And whatever they face, he is with them. And notice that it says that they walk through the valley. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The sheep don't stop in the valley. They don't stay there. The shepherd leads them through the valley. Now, we normally associate this verse with death because it says, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We normally think of it in those terms, the promise of God to walk through us, the valley of death with us, and to escort us safely to the other side. And it is certainly that. I'm not saying it's not that. It certainly is that. And as a pastor and a chaplain, I have been with many, many, many believers as the time of death drew near. And I can tell you that nothing is more precious to a believer as he or she faces death than the assurance that their faith in God brings. It is more precious than gold as death draws near. So yes, this absolutely includes that. It's the idea that the Lord is with us in time of death. But it's not limited to that. There's more than that. It also speaks to any time of danger or peril in your life. It's the promise that those who trust in the Good Shepherd never go through anything alone. The Good Shepherd is always with you. We do not live alone. We do not die alone. The Good Shepherd is always there. He is our protector. George Adam Smith was a Scottish preacher, lived from the mid-1800s into the early 1900s. Now, he was from Scotland, but he actually lived most of his life in the Holy Land, in Palestine. And he wrote a number of books, but in one of his books he tells of an encounter that he had with an Arab shepherd. They stopped on the road. The man was out with his flock of sheep. And they began to chat. And Adam Smith asked him, where do your sheep sleep at night? And the shepherd took him. It was close by. They are on his property. And the shepherd walked with George Adam Smith over to the pen, I guess the corral, where the sheep were kept, and he pointed to them and he said, this is where they sleep at night. And it was kind of simple, it was just 4 walls and an entrance, but no door. Nothing that closed, just a way for them to walk in, but they could easily walk out too. Nothing that closed, just 4 walls and an open space. And so George Adam Smith asked the shepherd, he said, this is where they sleep at night, but there's no door. And the shepherd said to him, I am the door. Now, this man was not a Christian, this shepherd, okay? He was not reading some type of, a Christian imagery back into this psalm. He was telling him what actually happened. He said, once the sheep go into the corral at night, I lie down in the entranceway. I lie down across it. And no predator can get into the corral without going over me first. I am the door. Man, that's the promise of this verse. It's the shepherd saying, I am the door. I am the good shepherd. When you are my sheep, when you follow my leadership, it doesn't matter what you go through in this life or up to the end of this life, up to the time of death. I am your good shepherd. And even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will be with you. That is the promise of the Good Shepherd. Now, next Sunday, we're going to continue on in this great psalm and read up to the conclusion of it. I hope you'll be here with me for that next Sunday. I'm looking forward to doing that. May God bless the reading and studying of his word today. I hope that this psalm has been an encouragement to you. Dedicate yourself today to following the Good Shepherd. And when you do that, he will lead you in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. All right, look forward to being with you again next Sunday. Until then, may God bless and keep you.